Good evening and welcome to the Library of Company of Philadelphia's Fireside Chats. I'm Jim Downs. I am the newly appointed director of the program in African American history here at the Library Company. As some of you may know, the Library Company is over 300 years old. It is the original Library of Congress. It houses countless important documents about our nation's past, and I am very happy to be the director of the program in African American history, which includes some of the richest, most dazzling documents about Black Philadelphia in the 18th and 19th century. Tonight, I have the wonderful opportunity to welcome A.M.E. Cohen as part of our series Fireside Chats, and she'll be talking about her new book, which is Black History in the Philadelphia Landscape. A.M.E. Cohen spent 20 years as a middle school and high school social studies teacher. In 2013, she became the director of education at the film company History Making Productions, where she developed education materials to accompany documentaries, mostly about the history of Philadelphia. She produced Octavius V. Catto, A Legacy for the 21st Century, which won a Mid-Atlantic Emmy Award for Historic Cultural Program Feature, which is quite an amazing accomplishment. And it's an important contribution to our nation's understanding of the past. She is a frequent contributor to Hidden City, an online magazine about Philadelphia's history and the built environment. And her writing has been published in the Pennsylvania Gazette, Legacies, Tablet, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. So I'm going to turn it over to A.M.E., who's going to talk about her book for about 45 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A. If you have questions, I ask you to just please add them to the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and then at the end, I will collate those questions and then address them to A.M.E. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm thrilled to be part of this series, and hello, A.M.E.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks so much. And thank you everyone for being here this evening. And okay, so I'm excited to be talking to you about my book. And I always like to begin with the elephant in the room, which is what is a middle-aged Jewish woman like myself doing writing a book on Black history? Well, to answer that question, I have to go back about 20 years. I was a teacher at Masterman School in Philadelphia, and I had twice taught an elective on the history of Philadelphia. And in 2005, Philadelphia became the first district in the country to require a year of African American history for every high school student. And at that time, no one in my social studies department had taught Black history. There were no Black members, which is pretty typical of social studies departments across the city as well as across the country. And because I had taught this Philadelphia history course, and because there's so much Black history in Philadelphia history, I knew like a little bit about Black history. And so I volunteered to teach the course. And right from the beginning, local history was always a focus. I went on a very steep learning curve, a very exciting, challenging, provocative intellectual journey. I love teaching the course, but as Jim said, I left the classroom and became director of education for History Making Productions, where I wrote curriculum and also got involved in producing some films, often about local Black history. And then I also started writing for Hidden City for a while. I was a monthly contributor, and many, not all, but many of the stories that I wrote were about local Black history. And what I found from my students, from my colleagues, from parents when I was teaching, from our film audiences, and from Hidden City readers was that there's a real hunger in this city for information about our deep and rich Black history. And I also knew that there wasn't like an accessible book meant for the general reader that gave one a good overview of Philadelphia's Black history. So I started to think, this really could be useful. I wish I had had something like this when I started teaching the Black history course. And so what got me over the hump and ready to submit a proposal to Temple University Press was the great Toni Morrison, who once said, if there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. So that's how I got to the point where I felt ready and Temple Press felt I was ready to write about Black history. Why the focus on the landscape? Well, a couple reasons. One is that also while I was teaching the Black history course, I often used things like memorials and monuments to connect the past to the present. And a very quick example is thinking about founding father Thomas Jefferson. And of course, in an African American history course, what one recognizes that he drafted the Declaration of Independence, one of our finest founding documents. But in an African American history course, we also look at the fact that he was an enslaver on a major scale, that in the notes on the state of Virginia, he said just scathing and horrendous stuff about Black people as a race, while at the same time, he was having children with um, a woman that he owned, Sally Hemings. So it really complicates our idea of Thomas Jefferson. So if I would ask students, well, now that you know about this side of Thomas Jefferson's past, do you view the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., one of our finest memorials in the nation's capital, do you view it any differently? Should any adjustments be made? Should there be something posted with qualifying statements? What do we do? And, I'd throw that out to a group of students whose ideas would range everywhere from do nothing, don't touch it to push the whole thing in the Potomac. And thus, that was often a tool I used because it got students excited and talking and thinking and realizing that our past is very much with us. And another reason I liked talking about things in the landscape, such as markers, was back before I was even teaching the African American history course. Soon after I started teaching at Masterman, a group of students in my History of Philadelphia course applied for a historical marker about an anti-Black riot that took place in 1842. And that marker was actually accepted by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. And that taught me that not only can we learn from our landscape, but we can also shape the landscape. A picture of another historical marker. On the left, you see unveiling the marker, Charles Blockson. Charles Blockson was a collector of books, manuscripts, sheet music, artifacts, all kinds of information about the Black experience. And as late as 1990, there were only 2 state historical markers that reference Black history. So in the early 1990s, Charles Blockson got some grant money and used his collection to submit dozens of proposals for historical markers, and many of those were accepted. If you see Black history historical markers around the city, you'll notice that many of them are 1991, 1992. And at this point, about a third of our markers are about Black history. Now, this marker in particular wasn't unveiled until 2016, but I have it in the slideshow for two reasons. One is that Charles Blockson, who passed away about a year ago, said that of all the markers he was responsible for, this was the one of which he was most proud. And secondly, it gives you a sense of the chronology of the book. Chronologically, it starts in the 1600s. And then, of course, in Philadelphia, we've really become a city of murals, and murals are another way that we can learn about our history in the landscape. I chose this mural of Father Paul Washington, who was the pastor of the Church of the Advocate, and in the late 1960s, very early 1970s, he made the Church of the Advocate a very welcoming place for the Black Power movement. So I chose this mural because that's the other bookend. The book chronologically ends in the very late 1960s, early 1970s with the Black Power movement. But in terms of the updates to the landscape, that goes right up to the present day. Public sites such as parks like the Julian Abel Park in the Graduate Hospital area are another way that we mark history in the landscape. And names of buildings like school buildings. So for example, this building is a school on 12th Street in South Philadelphia. The former name of the school was the Andrew Jackson School. And it was a school for a very diverse, very mixed community, and members of the community felt that they didn't think that a president who was both an enslaver and responsible for mass slaughter and dislocation of Native Americans really represented their community. So they went through a process and eventually came up with the name of Fanny Jackson Coppin, who was an African-American educator. She taught at Philadelphia's Institute for Colored Youth and was also an administrator there. Street names is another way that we mark our history in the landscape. So this one, an honorary street name for Richard Allen along Allen's Lane in Westmount area, actually right near my house, is an example of a pretty easy kind of street marker to get. Richard Allen, if you don't know, was a leader in Philadelphia's free Black community in the late 18th, early 19th century, and is also the founder of Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, and really of the whole A.M.E. religion. It's much more challenging to get an entire street renamed, as was done when Columbia Avenue was renamed for the civil rights leader Cecil B. Moore. Historic sites like the Marian Anderson House and Museum is another way we can learn our history from the landscape. And this definition is how Monument Lab, a Philadelphia-based but nationally and internationally recognized group that looks at questions of how we represent history in our landscape. Monument Lab defines a monument as a statement of power and presence in public. So to me, all those examples I've just given you, markers, murals, public spaces, street names, historic sites, do fit the definition of a monument. But of course, we also have a limited number of monuments that showcase African American history. So assuming most of you are a local audience, you're familiar with the Octavius Catto statue and memorial. When it was unveiled in September 2017, Catto's statue was the first of an individual African American on public land in the city of Philadelphia, which is pretty remarkable if you think about how long and deep the history of African Americans in Philadelphia has been. But it was a very well-timed moment for our city in the sense that the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville that took place because of opposition to the removal of statues of Confederates like Robert E. Lee. It was a nice moment for the city to be showing that we were erecting a positive memorial. And Catto, if you're not familiar, was an activist, an educator, a baseball player, a Civil War recruiter, and most importantly, a fighter for voting rights in the city of Philadelphia. Tragically, he was cut down on Election Day in 1871. And this statue isn't just a statue, it's a whole memorial where if you're willing to spend 15, 20 minutes, you can really garner a pretty good sense of his biography. And then I just wanted to share these photos that give you some sense of the impact of what it is like to finally have a bronze figure on a granite pedestal of a Black man in the city of Philadelphia. So, as you've seen in my brief introduction here, there are a lot of representations of Black history in the Philadelphia landscape. And that would have been less true 5 years ago, 10 years ago, certainly 20, 50 years ago. There would be very, very little of it. So what I want to share with you now is a framework of how that kind of change comes to be. So first, we need to recognize that history is not the past, it's an ongoing process of interpreting the past. The past does not change, but our understanding of it does. Historical interpretations often reveal more about the times in which they are written than they do about past events. And then as our historical interpretations evolve, our monuments reflect new understanding. Now, this is not an automatic, this is not a quick process, but gradually over time, with organization, with community activism, with political will, with funding, the landscape in Philadelphia has certainly changed, especially since the dawn of the 21st century. And a really good example of how this process works is the President's House Memorial on Independence Mall. Right here at 6th and Market. And as I'm sure most of you know, Philadelphia was the nation's capital from 1790 to 1800. And at that time, the two presidents who lived here, Washington and then Adams, they lived at a house that looked like this on the corner of 6th and Market, then called 6th and High Street. After Adams moved to Washington, D.C., and the national capital was to the south of us, this area became increasingly commercial, and the building was converted into stores and a boarding house and so forth. Fast forward to 1949, and this is what we have at the corner of 6th and Market. Whoops. But the walls on that Washington Hall clothing store at that point in 1949 were still original to the President's House building. But as, again, I think probably most of you know, all these many blocks north of Independence Hall, here's Independence Hall up at the top of the screen, all these blocks north of Independence Hall were cleared in the 1950s to make room for Independence Mall. So there went what was left of the president's house. Eventually, what was constructed there were Park Service restrooms. And you can see toward the bottom of the screen a plaque, and that was a plaque that explained essentially that these toilets are sitting atop the home of former presidents. Again, a big fast forward. In the early 2000s, a new pavilion was being constructed for the Liberty Bell. And during and before that construction, there was some archaeological work that was done, and an amateur historian named Ed Lawler, through his research, was able to prove that the entrance to the new Liberty Bell Pavilion would be directly adjacent to the slave quarters that George Washington had installed in the president's house. Now, when Lawler's research first came out, it caused an uproar among journalists. I'm sorry, among historians. Journalists picked up the story. Some community members were very upset. And at that point, 2002, the Park Service essentially says, well, you know, we've already gotten all this signage approved for the inside of this new building, and we're kind of ready to have a big ceremony to open it, so we don't really want to do anything. The uproar continued, and eventually the Park Service decided that they would indeed acknowledge the presence of slave quarters so close to the entryway to the Liberty Bell. But then attention turned to the president's house site itself. And over a process of a number of years, legislation was passed and funding was set aside to build a memorial on the House of the President's site, but that memorial would not be primarily about the presidents who lived there. It would be focused on the 9 enslaved people who toiled for George Washington while he was in Philadelphia. And so when this memorial opened in 2010, it really marked a sea change in how our founding fathers' history is seen, not just in Philadelphia, but really across the Park Service. This was the first memorial to enslaved people. And again, the conversation started in 2002. Just 8 years later, they went from, no, we're not going to change a thing, to we're going to build a memorial that is going to focus on the experience of the enslaved. I want to share one more case study with you, and this is a case study that relates kind of directly to the library company, which is why I wanted to share it. I'll just take a moment before I launch into a whole nother story to say the way the book is set up is there are 19 chapters, and each chapter is a case study about an individual, an event, an institution in Black history, and how that history is represented in the landscape. The chapters are about 10 pages each, so it's a very accessible book. It's not for an academic audience. And at the end of many of the chapters, there's a reflection by someone who was either instrumental in the representation in the landscape, or in the more recent chapters, the reflections are by people who actually participated in the history. And then also at the end of every chapter, there is a to-do list of things that you can do if you want to further explore the content of the chapter. So now let's get to a sort of convoluted story, but it is going to connect Black history and the library company and all the themes of the book. So James Logan, as you may well know, was William Penn's secretary. He was a mayor of Philadelphia, a chief justice of Pennsylvania, at one point acting governor of Pennsylvania. Um, he was a scholar, wrote many, many articles. He was a mentor to Ben Franklin, also a mentor to John Bartram. And he was a book collector on a massive scale. What you're looking at here is the summer residence he built in the neighborhood that now has his name. It's in Logan. It's kind of in the middle of Logan, Olney, Germantown, Nicetown, and it is called Stenton and still stands today. So he has this massive book collection, and he knows that when he is going to die, that he wants to be able to make this collection available for people to use. And so he built what's called the Loganian Library. It was on the corner of 6th and Walnut. It's long since gone, but it had one of the largest collections of books, many Latin and Greek books, in all of North America. But eventually, and I'm not going to go into the details, the management of the library got complicated. One of the trustees of the library had been Benjamin Franklin. And so in 1792, the entire collection of the Loganian Library was donated to the Library Company of Philadelphia. And that about doubled the size of the library company. Now, the library company had several different locations, but for our purposes, we are going to skip to this building. This was the location immediately before the current location on Locust Street. This is the Ridgeway building at Broad and Christian. If you drive by it today, you might know it better as the High School for the Creative and Performing Arts of Philadelphia, but it did house the library company. Just want to give you a peek inside of this neoclassical building because it's so beautiful. But coming back to Logan and our story, this is a photo from 1939 when a monument is being unveiled on the steps of the Ridgeway building, then housing the Library Company of Philadelphia. And it is a memorial honoring James Logan. It was made by a Logan descendant, Thomas Pym Cope. So this photo is 1939, but then, of course, the library company moves to its Locust Street location, and this monument goes into storage. Okay, now we're returning to the inside of Stenton. Don't worry, we'll all pull together. This is a photo from 1956 of two members of the Junior Committee of the National Society of Colonial Dames of America. They had taken over, the Dames had taken over as stewards of Stenton. And so they were very careful about trying to restore the house to its 18th century and early 19th century splendor with authentic furnishings and housewares and so forth. This is a photo from 1965 of some Logan descendants when Stenton was named as a National Historic Landmark. But in both this photo and this one, we can well assume that they are thinking of Logan and his immediate descendants as statesmen, as successful gentlemen farmers and merchants, and as scholars. But now we're in a different day. And in 2018, this Logan Memorial that had been in front of the Ridgeway building, the Association for Public Art in the city tells Stenton they don't want to store it anymore. They want to bring it back to Stenton Manor. So this is 2018. So let's think about 2018. By 2018, the Black Lives Matter movement is 5 years old. By 2018, the Unite the Right rally has happened in Charlottesville. It's a time of much different sensibilities and historical interpretations. So when we think about James Logan through a 2018 lens, we recognize that, yes, he was a statesman and all those other things, but he also ran a plantation that was staffed in part with enslaved people. We also recognize that part of his wealth came from the rum trade, which was based on slavery. And we recognize that he was a chief architect of the walking purchase, a infamous land swindle, which ripped much of Bucks County away from the Lenape people in a very tricky deal. So in 2018, this is what I call in the book an inconvenient gift. But Stenton, the curators and caretakers and the National Society of Colonial Dames who still run Stenton, they don't think, well, let's melt this down for scrap. They see it as a challenge. And it becomes part of a dual challenge because of this 1912 plaque that was installed also by the colonial dames that says, in memory of Dinah, the faithful colored caretaker of Stenton, who by her quick thought and presence of mind saved the mansion from being burned by British soldiers in the winter of 1777. So how the story goes, and it's really mostly through oral tradition, is that Dinah, who had long been enslaved by James Logan's son and his wife. She was actually a dower property of Hannah Emlyn, who married James Logan's son. Dinah, when she was freed at her own request in 1776, chose to stay on at Stenton as a paid caretaker, probably because her grandson was still indentured at Stenton. During the Revolutionary War, Stenton served at one time as a headquarters for General Howe of the British. It was also at one point a headquarters for George Washington, but it was often left empty by the Logan family and left in the hands of Dinah. So the story goes that after the Battle of Germantown, some British soldiers come by and tell Dinah, we're going to burn the house down. You might want to get any belongings you want to take out of there out, and where can we find some kindling? According to this story, Dinah points them to the barn. Soon enough, a British general or high-ranking British officer comes galloping along and says, we are looking for deserters. She says, I think you'll find them in the barn. They are promptly arrested. The arson never happens, and she's credited with saving Stenton. Now, this plaque, certainly the spirit of honoring and thanking Dinah still works in the 21st century, but the wording is very outdated. So what Stenton did was to take these two monuments and take it on as a challenge in what they called the Inequality in Bronze Project, which was a project with three goals. One, to work with our neighbors to create a 21st century memorial to Dinah, and the neighbors around Stenton are overwhelmingly African American. to elevate and commemorate Dinah's story, and to address the national debate about monuments and the absence of memorials to millions of enslaved Africans and African Americans whose contributions to our history remain ignored or silenced in many public spaces. So they took on this years-long community engagement process to decide what should be represented, how should it be represented. Eventually, the group reached a consensus that the artist who should do the work would be Karen Olivier, a self-described gay, Black, Trinidadian, Germantown resident. She's also an internationally acclaimed artist. And her design is called Right Here. And it's two benches that face each other. The benches have questions. On one side, there are questions for Dinah, such as, did you ever regret not letting the house burn? And what was your full name? Because there's no record of her last name. On the other side, there are similar questions for the viewer. The original plaque has been cleaned and restored and will be incorporated onto one of those pillars. And although this originally was supposed to be unveiled, I forget if it was 22 or 23, but COVID, supply chain delays, this complication, that complication, it will finally be installed in 2 days from now. So on behalf of Stenton, it would be wonderful if anyone who's watching this could come and join on Saturday from 2 to 4 p.m. There's going to be a big celebration. They'd like it if you register, just so they know how many people to expect. And I believe the website will go in the chat. Also in the chat will be an article I wrote recently for Hidden City about Dinah and the Dinah Memorial. But if you want to see the historical landscape really changing before your eyes, this would be a wonderful opportunity to do that. And I want to share with you, just before I put a bunch of print on the page, I want to tell you what I'm sharing. And this is one of the reflections from the book. And it's a reflection written by Karen Olivier, the artist, about the Dinah Memorial. And here's what she says. I believe Dinah's memorial, which is also a monument, should allow for multiple perspectives, histories, and narratives to come to the fore as a site for inquiry, interpretation, and imaginings of the future. The best monuments are instruments, offering a mirror to witness ourselves, our community, our city, and our country. They are active, shifting, temporal, and contemporary. And though little is known about Dinah, this commemoration of her legacy, this physical marker, this evidence, must strive to be more than solely a symbolic gesture. I believe it can be imbued with the power to craft a continually evolving American history, adding Dinah's story to the narratives that become our collective heritage. And then I want to share with you another quote. This is a quote that Karen Olivier chose to put on the memorial itself, on one of those pillars. It's from Alice Walker. Healing begins where the wound was made. And then finally, to wrap this up and really to try and convey the gist of my entire book, I'm going to share another quote with you. Before I do that, I want to say that it may seem that markers, murals, street names, even monuments, well, they're not going to change the past, and they're not going to ensure a more just future. But as I heard again and again and again as I was working on the book, they matter. They're important. They make a difference. So the quote I want to share with you now in closing is from the young poet Amanda Gorman, who read her poem, The Hill We Climb, at Biden's inauguration. And a line from that poem goes, "Being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it." So with that, I want to thank you so much for your attention. Eager to hear your reactions and responses. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Amy. That's really terrific. An amazing, wonderfully engaging, and most of all, important project. Thank you. We have some question. We have one question right now in the Q&A. We hope that you will, if you have questions, begin typing them in. Amy's happy to answer them. The first is from Courtney Byrne. She writes, "Thank you, Amy, for writing this very important book. I was curious why you didn't include the Black Cowboys," and she puts cowboys in quotes, "of Philadelphia in your narrative. You mentioned the horse-drawn streetcars in 19th century, on the 19th century streets, but not the black horse stables that have proliferated since." She identifies herself as a PhD candidate at Temple, where she's writing her dissertation on the topic of black stables, and she says that she's thankful that you have omitted it because it's a gap that she can fill in her own research. So I'm hoping you could address that question.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that comment. And I recently read the book about, I can't think of his last name, Kareem. I'm a wonderful Philadelphian who became a polo champion because of his experience in the Work to Ride program, and I'm familiar with the Fletcher Street stables. I would love to see what you have to write about that group. And they, I guess, like many people, when that horse escaped and was galloping down 95 from that escape from the Fletcher Street stable, that certainly brought things more to my attention, as well as Kareem's book. But it's not a history that I'm deeply familiar with. So let me know when you have something out on it.
That's great. Just looking to see if there are other questions. Courtney writes back, "Thank you." Okay, great. Anyone else? Let's see, I'm also checking. I mean, I have questions, but I don't want to manipulate, hog the time. But let me ask you this. I mean, one of the interesting things for me as a historian has been to sort of stumble upon a lot of these great markers that you mentioned in Philadelphia. And there's one that always stuck out to me, which is about the Mossel family. And I think it's off of Broad Street. It's a free black family. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about them. And I think she goes on to write in the 19th century one of the first histories of black people, and it's included in the Schomburg's collection, The Pen is Ours, where it's Nathan Mossel as the father, but it's the daughter who I think is a historian. Do you know anything about how that marker came to be? Was it from the family? Was it from people in the community? Does it even ring a bell? Is it just more work to do?
I mean, I'm certainly familiar with that family, and in my book, I have a chapter about Sadie Tanner Moselle Alexander. I mean, they're a very old, prominent family. They're also a family connected by, is it by marriage or no? I think Paul Robeson's mother, I think, was connected to that
Okay.
family, and I have a chapter about the Paul Robeson
Okay.
house. In generally, if a marker says 1991 or 1992, it's probably Charles Blockson. And if not,
Right.
it could be from anywhere.
Right.
Because, yeah.
Right. No, I'm curious because one of the things that's fascinated me since I was doing research at the Library Company of Philadelphia for my first book in the early 2000s was just where are the descendants of the free Black community thinking about placing their history and recognizing their past and whether they will be donating more materials to LCP or if they're their own private,
Mhm.
still in private family hands, or if they've been involved in commemorating these spaces. I just think there's just this really fascinating history about how that's all connected. One of the questions that came out in the Q&A, and I actually think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to definitely allow you to do it. Any mention of Ona Judge that escaped from the president's house in Philadelphia? This is the Erica Dunbar book, never caught, but there's also an Eric Armstrong Dunbar story about this as well. So I don't know if you can answer that.
Yes. I tell that whole story in the chapter on the president's house. And I also, when I was working at History Making Productions, we produced a film called Sisters in Freedom. And the opening of that film and the closing of the film are focused on Ona Judge. And so as part of
Right,
that film, I developed a really in-depth document-based lesson
right,
about a judge that uses like the letter that George Washington wrote trying to pursue Ona Judge. He pursued her really until he died. Um, so yes, I tell this story in the book, but then also on my website, I have what I call a sort of teacher's guide because it's really not a formal teacher's guide. It's a lot of teaching materials I've developed over the years that are relevant. And so this very in-depth lesson about Ona Judge is on my website. And
right.
yeah, Erica's terrific.
Now, Eric, right. And so there's definitely a marker in Fairfax and Mount Vernon, but there's also a mural on Sixth and Market. So that's also really so that's really fascinating. So great. All right. Any other questions?
Well, I
Um,
know
I have
before
a
we
couple.
started, Allison was asking me about how I use the library company
Right,
resources
right,
for the book and in my research. And um, soon after I left the classroom, there was an exhibit at the library company that still exists online called Genius of Freedom that was focused on the Reconstruction period. And I ended up leading a team of teachers that wrote lessons for the Genius of Freedom exhibit. Um, and the second chapter in the book is about Washington Square and when it was a center for free and enslaved Black life. And so most of that research was based on library company resources. But the other way I use the library company is the image database that the library company has that of online digital images is phenomenal. I'm just like trying to come up with a superlative and the ease of use. I mean, it's really clear that the library company wants to share the information because, I dealt with a lot of different places trying to get permission to use materials. And in some places, it was multiple pages and sometimes even in a charge. And the library company, it was like, yeah, acknowledge us, thank you. I mean, there was a procedure, but the library company probably has the second most credits to me in terms of images in the book.
A couple of other questions have come in. Omar Carter asked first, thanks you for your talk. and then asks, do you think Black Americans who descend from slaves in America should receive reparations? Why not? Please explain. So this is another, question that often comes up, doing Black history and excavating this past, what are the political ramifications for today? And I think that's the framework of that question. So
Um, yeah, so the simple answer is yes. The complicated part is what form do should those reparations take? And to me, the systematic denial of property ownership and of access to top quality education are just really glaring examples of the long and continuing legacy of slavery. So that's about what I can say. Yes to reparations. The form they take, I don't know.
right. And I think, one of the things I thought was really shocking about your book was that you have this opening image of the transatlantic slave trade in Philadelphia, which was fascinating. And I think that's showing how even a place like Philadelphia, which is often not considered to be a hub for the transatlantic slave trade, was in fact an important spot. So that can help to inform contributions about reparations. All right, we have another question from Jocelyn White. She writes, in New Jersey, we have the Amistad Commission that focuses on African Americans and their contributions. Is there any comparable organization in Pennsylvania?
There's no like statewide organization that would be equivalent to the Amistad Commission in New Jersey. In terms of education, Pennsylvania has 500 school districts. It's much more balkanized than most other states. And so Philadelphia, we have this African American history mandate that calls not only for a year of African American history, but also for infusing African American studies, throughout the curriculum. That's really just Philadelphia. Cherry Hill, I know, also requires a year of Black history, but in a lot of Pennsylvania, I assume there's very little of it.
Right, in Jocelyn, as there's 600 school districts in Philadelphia, in New Jersey. Yeah, one of those things too is that a lot of places after the George Floyd summer are rethinking how to incorporate Black history. I know in Boston, they put out a call for a competition for various historians to submit proposals on how to acknowledge Boston's legacies towards slavery. So I think this is, like you said in the very beginning, Amy, this is an ongoing project of doing the work, and it's not one book that ends the conversation, but it's a book that generates more conversation. It's a book that generates more interest in the topic. I want to see if we have
Yeah,
any other
100%.
Yeah, we only
We
have a
have a
minute.
question if it's all right. Hello,
Hello,
everyone. My
you
name is
just popped in
Allison
here.
Kronstadt.
Okay.
I'm the events and programming coordinator here at the library company, so I've been behind the scenes working on this event. And Amy, I'm so struck by what you talked about in terms of James Logan. And we have a room in the library company called the Logan Room. And yeah, your talk just has me thinking, what recommendations might you have for how the library company could, we have a lot of material about slavery, but I'm thinking about the physical landscape of our building, and I don't know when the last time you came to visit was, but I'm wondering what we could do within the landscape of our building to memorialize Black history more effectively.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it would be interesting for folks at the library company to engage in a conversation with the people at Stenton, given that they are two Logan affiliated organizations. And I saw Paul Farber, who's the leader of Monument Lab, speak last week, and something that he said that it really stuck with me and I think is relevant for some of these questions is it's not so much the product. Like, I can't tell you, oh, well, you should have a QR code next to the name Logan Library so people can look up and learn that he was an enslaver. Like, what matters isn't what product I might think would work. It's what kind of process will you use to get input from community stakeholders to figure out together how to deal with that history. Does that make sense?
It definitely does. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Smart. Okay, so that brings us to our conclusion for tonight's program. I want to thank Amy so much for this really informative and insightful talk about her book, Black History in the Philadelphia Landscape, which is available at Temple University Press. If you go to the webinar chat, there will be a link where if you use the code T20P, you get a 20% discount. And if you're interested, of course, in supporting more library company programming, please consider becoming a member or donating today. We also placed the link for that in our chat. And next time, May 16th, our fireside chat will be on, the title is Death Becomes Her, Asiatic Femininity and the Aesthetics of Disfigurement. And it will be held on, again, May 16th. And it'll be with Michelle Lee. There's more information on the library calendar event schedule page. So I hope to see you then. And once again, thank you so much, Amy. The only downside of doing a virtual presentation is that you don't get to hear all the people clapping and smiling at the end of your excellent presentation. But thank you again for doing this and for sharing your work. I'm really excited to dig into the book. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. I enjoyed it.
Great. All right. See you later, everyone. Good night.